In today's video, we have a demo of my custom panel gap removing tool, professional welding practices, and the wrong way to remove sound deadening. I always knew the wall at Shannonville would take a car from me one day. I wasn't expecting it to be a couple of weeks ago, but here we are. After 3 hot laps on the rev limiter, I definitely should have known that my tires just don't have the grip that they once had. And the proper thing to do would have been getting off the track. What's done is done, and now I have a lot of work to do to prepare for the next event. So let's get started. The first and most important step of fabrication is the S&S, squat and stare. We want to do this intently to decide where we want to cut. Doing so makes you look like a skilled fabricator, and generally causes more issues than I'd like to admit. Now that we've finished the squat and stare, it's time to start cutting. I've decided to cut here, here, and here. We're going to find out in about half an hour whether this was a good choice or not. I've missed the mark by a lot on this frame rail, but that's alright because we're going to come in with some precision tools, starting with the Sawzall, moving on to the hammer, back to the Sawzall, back to the hammer, and then maybe a drill and a grinder. It'll come out eventually. I don't own any CAD software, but I do have a fair bit of CAD hardware. In my world, I use AutoCAD as in cardboard aided design. It works pretty good, and we're going to use a lot of that in this video. Mostly because I'm cheap and I bought the exact amount of metal that I need for this project, so I really can't afford any mistakes. Speaking of metal, 3/8 thick steel is not recommended to be cut on a Princess Auto bandsaw, and the blades really don't last, nor does it happen in any type of fast time. I've also discovered that the body is not straight, even though the cardboard was, so we've got to do a little bit of touch-ups with the grinder and the hammer, and then the grinder again, and probably the hammer again. We've also pulled out the die grinder to get into some really tiny spots. Contrary to what the name suggests, it does not make me want to rethink why I'm doing this, and in fact helps quite a bit. Our cardboard design work is paid off, so now with everything in place, it's time to weld it all. We're going to weld all the way around the plates that we made. They're designed to tie in the remainder of the trunk floor, the subframe, the frame rail, and the strut tower all in one piece. It also gives us a very strong and square surface to mount the rear frame on. When the car went into the wall, I was lucky that it didn't shift any of the subframe mounting points. In this case, we could just weld new plates in, and it's pretty much finished. We don't need to worry about moving or adjusting anything, since the subframe still unbolts and bolts in cleanly. Welding is fun and all, but we do have to be careful of fires, especially when we're welding right beside the gas tank fill-up. You know, things happen sometimes. If you're playing around with metal fabrication in your garage, the 2 biggest things you're going to learn on the side are going to be first aid and firefighting. Right before I started this project, I considered whether I needed a frame machine, but then I forgot that I have a winch on a trailer. And I think that's pretty much the closest thing I'm going to get, and quite honestly, it worked a lot better than I was expecting. I've straightened out the quarters as best I can with a combination of winch, hammer, and more winch. There were a couple times where I might have put the winch in the wrong spot, and it kind of just pulled through. With most of the big stuff straightened out, we're going to go back inside and use the panel gap removal tool to fine-tune the straightness of all these body panels. I've been told it's a sledgehammer, but the label on it says that it's a panel gap removal tool, and I just follow the rules here. While this car is never going to be straight again in its life, it is plenty straight enough to put some fiberglass body panels over it, and if it gets hit again, so be it. We're done with all the chassis work and prep on the car, so now it's time to take some measurements and get building this tube frame. For this absolute unit of a rear frame, we're going to be using 4x5 3/16 wall rectangle tube. This stuff is stronger than probably anything else in the car, and I'm sure this is going to bite me in the ass one day when something else gets messed up because this didn't bend. I'm going to start by marking out all my lengths and the 245s on each side. This all has to get loaded into the bandsaw, which is about 10 times too small for this piece of tube, and I'm honestly not sure how it cut all the way. As it turns out, 4x5 is the limit of what this bandsaw can cut, so getting it to line up with a 45-degree angle was pretty difficult. It just needed some hammer to convince it to go in the right spot. After adjusting my super accurate cuts on the bandsaw with an angle grinder, we are going to fit everything up on the bench and weld it all before putting it on the car. It was at this point that I realized this thing weighs a lot, like 80 pounds a lot, and it's all going to hang over the back axle, probably better for drifting, maybe a little bit of extra grip, but I was not expecting it to weigh that much. The inside dimensions of the rectangle tube allow us to put a fuel cell in there if we ever wanted to. It's measured to be universal for pretty much any radium cell, which is what's common around here. Bash bar level to the car, we can weld it all up. It also makes a really easy and safe spot to mount anything that you need protected. It's not going to bend under any conditions, and if it does, you're going to have much bigger problems than just bending and breaking whatever was important. Since we cut everything out of the rear end, there's nowhere for the battery to go, so I completely forgot that we have to make a battery tray. I'm going to use a little bit of 1/8 flat plate and some 2x1 angle iron. All we're going to do is box in the battery with this 2x1 bar on the flat plate. There's a couple holes in the side of it, and we're going to use some J-hook style bolts just to hold the battery down onto the plate and then weld the plate onto the chassis. I was originally going to bolt this down somewhere, and then I decided to weld it, which required taking off a whole bunch of sealant and a whole bunch of sound deadening. I highly recommend buying some dry ice to get rid of the sound deadening, but this was kind of on a time constraint, and I did not think about having to do this, so we're using the torch, the scraper, the grinder, and a lot of solvent to get rid of it all cleanly. All in all, it took about half an hour to do it start to finish. With this area clear of all the sound deadening, tar, and seam sealer, there's a couple of panels that we have to remove with all the spot welds just to make it look a little better, and then we can start installing and welding in the battery plate. Now, I do have a couple of other projects that I have to finish right now, so I can't just finish this, so I'm going to paint everything with some rust-proof primer, let it sit for a little while, and then come back to finish it. While the car sits, I had to remind myself how to use the tube bender. I'm going to be bending 5 180-degree hoops out of thin wall 1.25" tubing. I believe it's 1/16 wall thickness. These are going to go all along the outside of the bash bar to protect from any more collisions. In a perfect world, the force of the crash will be absorbed when these hoops collapse, and that will absorb most of the energy from the impact and then keep it from bending the main tube frame behind it. We're also going to bend a piece of 1.5" 120 wall to use as a jacking point on the back, and that'll also protect the fuel cell if there was something there. The hoops came out to just under 180 degrees, but that makes it way easier to take it out of the die when you're finished bending it. On top of that, I'm not trying to shoot for an exact angle, I'm just going by the number of ratchets that I use, so that if I have to make another part, it's much more repeatable and takes way less time to make them. Now, this is where things started to really get tedious. We've got 16 of these little half circles marked out. We've got to cut them all out individually. We've already drilled the holes in the center of them, but this is going to be the mounts for our crash bar or our collapsible tubing. It's going to mount onto the main section that we fabricated. Once we've got all these cut out, we're going to head over to the grinder. At the grinder, we're just going to clean off the front half, turn them all into actual half circles since we can't quite bend the bandsaw blade. We're going to put a little chamfer on the flat side where we've got to weld it since it's 3/16 thick, matching the rectangle tube. We want to have a pretty good chamfer so the weld penetrates all the way through on both sides, and then we can go clean up the rectangle tube and slap it on. More prep is required since I painted the frame while it was in storage. I've just got to grind off a little square where each of the tabs are going to sit. The ones on the outer sides are already located, and then I'll locate the center ones evenly spaced once we've welded the outside ones in. With the one side all welded and mounted, I can do the layout for the two center pieces and then mark out all the other ones. Then we've just got to grind, prep, and weld in all the other tabs for all the other ones, while checking that each tube still fits between the tabs once I weld it, because they do pull together a little bit from the heat. Even though there's a ton of these little tabs, it only took 15 or 20 minutes to do all this work. Before we finish weld everything, I'm going to prep, fit up, and then weld in the tube that we bent for the lift point. Just goes on the bottom of the rail so that we have something to lift off of instead of having to go all the way to the diff with the jack. After taking the car to the track a couple of times, I can definitely say I would have put this a little bit lower. You still have to raise the jack up quite a bit before it gets to the lift point, and it doesn't hang low enough to hit anything when you're putting it on the trailer or on the track, so I could have left it down quite a bit more. Now all that's left for this is to finish weld it, drill all the holes in the tubes, and then paint it. Now, I'm not a professional welder. I'm mostly self-taught, and I've had a couple of classes in between and just a lot of experience doing random little projects like this. But if there's one thing that I have learned, and one thing that I've been told by everybody, is that you need to be very, very comfortable when you're welding. Best weld is going to be produced when you're in the most comfortable position. Which brings me to my next point of welding roll cages, tubes, tube chassis, and anything where space is tight. There's never a comfortable position. So, you gotta do your best. My personal favorite's just laying down. Only problem is, there's never any room to do it. This position was in one of the CWB handbooks that I read, or maybe it was the Sex Swing Owner's Manual, actually. I'm gonna go check that. If David Attenborough's ever taught me anything about bats, I'm pretty sure it was them sleeping upside down, so it must be a pretty comfortable position to weld in, right? Bad welding jokes aside, that's the end of the project. I had a brain fart and forgot to record some of the painting and final assembly stuff, but this is the final result. I'm pretty happy with it. It's going to work, it's going to be stronger, and the car is going to be at least drivable now. Now I'm headed to the track, and I'll catch you guys on the next video.